Hello, and welcome to the Whale Hunting Podcast, where we shine a light onto hidden worlds of money and power. I'm Tom Wright, and this week we're kicking off our second season of the show with a fascinating conversation with Jane Perlez. Jane was a foreign correspondent and longtime Beijing bureau chief for the New York Times, and is now host of the new podcast, Face Off, the US versus China, which launched at the start of April. The show dives into the defining issues of the US-China rivalry, its history, and what the future could hold for this relationship. So Jane, it's great to have you on the show. Thanks for being with us.
Pleasure to be here.
So my first question is, and this is rather a general one, but as a China watcher for many years, was this relationship always going to go south? There's this expression, the Thucydides trap, that a rising power like China is always going to come into contention and have an aggressive kind of relationship with a power that's already there, like the US. Or, in your view, were missteps made? And if so, what are the key moments in that relationship, and where were the missteps made?
Well, I think it was always likely to end up being a fraught relationship. I don't particularly ascribe to the Thucydides trap because I don't think that history goes in particular set patterns. But I think that the United States has long had a kind of evangelical zeal about wanting to bring democracy to other places. And so I think there was high and incorrect and irrational expectations, in a way, that China would somehow become more like the United States. And my favorite China book is actually To Change China, which is Jonathan Spence, America's best China historian, in my opinion, talking about how all these people from the Jesuits in 1644 to World War II with George Marshall went to China thinking they could change it and make it into some kind of other version of the United States. Well, you can't do that with a 5,000-year-old culture. It was always going to be different to the United States. So I think that was a very basic problem.
So do you think some of the key moments then are the political and democracy moments? So, for example, China's behavior in Xinjiang, the crackdown in Hong Kong, the Belt and Road Initiative trying to use economics to influence other states with their view of how political systems should work. Is that what the US is reacting to more than China's attempts to take over, the US economic hegemony of the world?
Well, I think you've cited quite recent examples. Xinjiang, which of course was obviously going to get under the skin of lawmakers in Washington because of the very incredible abuse of human rights and the terrible abuses that go on there with forced labor, and particularly since it involved forced labor with products that were sold in the United States. So that was an understandably unforgivable sin by the Chinese, but that's fairly recent, and Hong Kong is fairly recent. And by the way, I might say that those two things came to a crescendo, to a peak, under the Trump administration, and there was very little diplomacy, I think, actually, under the Trump administration, except to just push China out there and raise tariffs, and that was that, and to do some rather hostile acts. I don't know if you agree with me, but one of the hostile acts, I think, was chucking out 60 Chinese reporters from the United States, which was going to automatically get reciprocation from the Chinese. They were going to clamp down on us, American reporters in China. So it was a kind of a downward spiral. But I think you can go back to 2008, when the fiscal crisis happened, and the United States was obviously in a difficult position. And this confirmed, I think, in the minds of some Chinese leaders, and it said with Xi Jinping, who wasn't president yet, but he was vice president, it confirmed with them that the United States was on the decline and that they were going to try and take advantage of that. And I think that once Xi came to power, he was determined to take advantage of what he saw as China's rightful place in the world. And so that's when you saw the push in the South China Sea to build artificial islands, and you saw the push against the Japanese. That's all about Xi Jinping deciding that 2012 and his period, his presidency, was going to be the moment when China would seek to gain its rightful place in Asia. And I think that's fundamentally what's at it. He really believes that the United States doesn't belong in Asia, that China does, And I see this as an irrevocable problem. And we close our podcast series, actually. We have a very tough episode on Taiwan in which Lyle Goldstein, who I interview for most of it, points out that an Atlantic Council paper last fall argues that the United States may need to use nuclear weapons if it comes to war in Taiwan, because the conventional weapons disparity has become so great. You know, the Chinese are very close and they've got more conventional strength compared to the United States, and so nuclear weapons might be necessary. I mean, this sounds to me to be lunacy. So I close the episode by quoting a paper by Phil Zelikow, who I think is a very balanced, thoughtful analyst, and another author. They did it for the Council on Foreign Relations last year, and they say that there's no grand bargain to be done between the United States and China, that they are both seeking primacy in Asia, and that they are both heading to catastrophe. And the only way this catastrophe can be avoided is with quality diplomacy. Emphasis, I say, on quality.
So Xi Jinping comes to power in 2012, and one of the key things that he does soon after is the Chinese state starts to build more settlements on disputed islands, or actually islands that other countries in the Asia-Pacific region count as their own. And you have your first episode of Face Off, your great new podcast about this rising tension, is about how 24 years ago a US spy plane was shot down over China. An in-air collision with another Chinese fighter. And the US spy plane was forced to emergency land in Hainan Island. And that was resolved diplomatically. And you make the point in that first episode of this that is very unlikely to happen today, right? The tensions and the backdoor diplomacy is not there anymore.
Oh, I think that people in the State Department and the Pentagon are very worried about this because the stakes are so high in the South China Sea, and until a couple of months ago, Chinese fighter planes, same kinds of planes were buzzing, same kinds of American planes, and similar things happening on the water. And at the moment, we're in a little bit of an abeyance thanks to the meeting between Biden and Xi Jinping, but I don't think people think that's really going to hold. And so if there was another collision, or maybe when there's another collision, there are great concerns of what could happen. For example, if the Chinese plane damaged the American surveillance plane so badly that the American plane sank and killed 24 Americans, this would be an incredibly difficult situation. There would be calls in Congress for, could be war. And on the ground, on the waters, how the Americans would try to get to that crash site. Imagine this. The Americans would try to get to the crash site and try to find out where the American plane was and maybe try and retrieve bodies. But the Chinese have more Navy ships now. Their Navy is bigger than the American Navy. You know this better than I. And so it would become tremendously difficult for the Americans even to get to the crash site, perhaps.
And the US continues to run spy plane surveillance as it did 20 plus years ago. There's no difference there.
As far as we know, they don't advertise it, but as far as we know, they haven't been stopped, so one has to assume that they're still going on, even though perhaps...
And of course, the US recently shot down Chinese spy balloon over the US, so this stuff is still going on.
Right. I mean, maybe the surveillance flights by the United States aren't as many as they were. And by the way, back in 2001, there were people arguing that these surveillance flights were kind of unnecessarily provocative, that you didn't really need to do them because you can see a lot of stuff by other means.
Right. You referred earlier to this kind of strange, you think you said it was an Atlantic Council report, which said that the US may need to resort to the threats of nuclear war because they're now outnumbered in conventional forces in the Asia-Pacific. They, of course, have, I think, 10 times as many nuclear warheads as the Chinese, don't they? They have, I think, 5,000 warheads to like 500 or something like that. We're very unlikely, though, to see that. I mean, despite all this talk of terrible relations, and there are terrible relations between China and the US, nuclear war is very far off, right? There are still many channels between these two countries.
Well, one hopes so, but it's not really a hopeful sign that Xi Jinping, I think for understandable reasons, because he sees China as being a great power, is increasing the number of warheads, and they're digging missile silos in Xinjiang like there's no tomorrow. I mean, it's a very planned increase. but he feels that they should catch up to the United States. So it's hardly reassuring, particularly since basically all of the arms control treaties that kept things on a fairly simmering hold, if you like, no longer exist. I mean, we're in an era of no arms control treaties. And by the way, as Tong Zhao says in our second episode, there's no appetite in China to sign on to nuclear control agreements because they feel that they have to, become equal.
Let's switch to the economic angle to all of this. In your great episode about the relationship between Xi Jinping and Biden, you talk about how, Biden has been quite aggressive towards Xi, called him a thug and a dictator. And of course, from 2022 started to put export controls onto semiconductor chip technology export to China. That's a huge blow to China, right? And China retaliated by restricting rare earth mineral exports, which are important in the manufacture of semiconductors. Where do you see all of that going?
I think there's going to be outsized competition. And I met the other day with Jin Lichun, who is the head of the new Chinese multilateral bank, AIIB. And it's a bank that's sort of a companion to the World Bank and other Western-founded multilateral banks. And he takes the line that these actions by the United States will just spur China on to greater innovation. I think there is a strand of thought that they will put all hands to the wheel and determinedly try and bring themselves apace with the United States on the AI high-tech front. And, I've always taken the attitude, maybe it's wrong, but I always take the attitude, never underestimate the determination of the Chinese Communist Party.
I mean, they had a policy that I think they scrapped in 2018 where they were trying to attract foreign experts in technology to come and live in China, right? And I think it wasn't very successful. That's part of their problem, isn't it? As a world economic power, it hasn't been able to attract people in a way that the US attracts people to come and live there and bring their, great mathematical knowledge or physics knowledge or whatever it is.
I think it is a great weakness, and it's understandable that talented Western people don't want to go and live in a society that now has got, such super surveillance, is so rigid in many ways, and can be scary for an outsider. But, I wouldn't underestimate either the inventiveness and the determination of the Chinese scientists at all.
In episode 2, you talk about the huge interdependence of Apple and how it relies on Chinese workers at Foxconn, company there, to produce like the majority of the iPhones. The Biden administration has tried to, has put export controls on semiconductors, but there's still a huge amount of interdependence, right?
Well, the Apple supply chain to me is an absolutely fascinating story, Tom. That's because I think of it, I don't know how you see it, but I think of it as the marriage between two of the most secretive organizations in the world, the Chinese Communist Party on one hand and the Apple Corporation on the other. I mean, I've never covered Apple as a journalist, but I have colleagues who do and have, and it's impossible to get any information out of Apple so it's a very fascinating relationship. And I think this marriage is getting a little rocky around the edges. We interview Wayne Ma, who I think is an extraordinary reporter. Maybe you know him because you're both at the Wall Street Journal.
Oh, colleague of mine, yes.
Yes, really, really amazing reporter. He was in Beijing for a number of years, and he learned a lot about Apple while he was there. And one of the things he learned while he was there was this extraordinary deal between Tim Cook and the NDRC, the main economic platform for Chinese investment. And he found this MOU, which showed the reason why Tim Cook was coming to China so much in 2016. We were sitting there in Beijing, and Tim Cook would turn up every couple of months and have this very worried look on his face, and there were photographs of him at Zhongnan High, the headquarters of the Communist Party. What the hell's going on? And it turned out that Wayne unearthed this MOU in which Apple agreed to pay the NDRC $275 billion over 5 years to continue production in China and to help China with tech developments. And this was all coming at a time when China was really bearing down on Apple, requiring that it keep its data in China, taking apps off the Apple Store, etc. And now the pressure's just even higher. So it seems that Apple's going to have to look elsewhere, at least for some production. But I think Wayne's very interesting. He says it's going to take Apple a lot of work and a long time to be able to produce in other places. You know, Tim Cook very tellingly was in Vietnam 2 weeks ago and was in Indonesia last week. Well, good luck. I mean, I lived for 5 years in Indonesia. Maybe you've lived there. I don't see Apple factories being populated in Indonesia anytime soon. I mean, it's a great country and it's got a lot of people, but it doesn't have the training and it doesn't have the scale of China.
I think you say in episode 2 about Apple that the Foxconn facility has workers the size of the city of Tampa in Florida. Is that right?
Correct.
So the scale they're operating on is something you're going to find it very hard to replicate. And of course, that MOU that Wayne broke a few years ago in the information about Apple spending $275 billion, that included an investment of $1 billion in Didi, the Chinese Uber. But what China really wants is the technology to get transferred, because obviously Foxconn is not making the kinds of margins that Apple is, that it's making low margin business. And they want to move, it's the same thing with the chips. They want to move up the value chain. And it's just difficult to do that, isn't it? But Apple at the same time is in a conundrum because it can't extricate itself from that workforce.
Exactly. And talking about transfer, I mean, I think it's already starkly in front of us. Wayne points out that Luxshare, which is a Chinese competitor to Apple, headed by a woman, Grace Wang, who's quite a senior member of the Communist Party, Luxshare is taking some work from Apple. It's cutting into Apple's manufacturing prowess there.
This is a perfect time to talk about TikTok. Obviously, Congress has just passed a bill that would force ByteDance, the Chinese owner of TikTok, to sell TikTok within a year. And that's important because a lot of TikTok's, or the majority of TikTok users, are in the US, billions of them.
170 million.
Sorry, not billions.
More than half the population.
170 million, more than half the population.
It's all right.
Sometimes it just seems like billions.
I think you've got this competition between US and China on the mind in population too.
Exactly. So I think one of the things there is that ByteDance is saying that it's got algorithms that it doesn't want to give up to the US side. So it isn't all one way, right? Obviously, TikTok is an incredibly powerful algorithm that allows it to serve up videos and short form content to users around the world. So where do you see the TikTok battle going? It's one everyone's watching.
It's a very interesting situation. Look, I'm basically a purist on the First Amendment, and I also believe that the United States is big enough, strong enough, and innovative enough to overcome the so-called threat from TikTok. I just find it incredible that the weight of the United States government should come down on dance videos. But of course, it's much more serious than that, I know, because there are these charges of TikTok being used for other means.
Well, spying, which you talk about in episode 6 of your podcast. Do you see it as a credible spy threat?
Look, I wish I knew. I wanted to do a bonus episode on TikTok, but I couldn't really find the person who could, A, describe why it is that the algorithm has been devised in Beijing and is such an incredible secret and no one else can get into it. I mean, that to me is one of the incredible things. Why is this algorithm so different, and how is it so different to the algorithms that do the other social media in the United States? I'd love to find someone who could explain that.
Yeah, very complicated. Let's talk about spying, though, because you do have that episode coming up. This is obviously you can refer to this as a new Cold War. It has elements of the Russian-US relationships in the 80s and 90s. Obviously, a lot of spying happened then. Explain to us sort of what goes on in US-China spying today. How does it play out?
Well, who knows? I mean, let's start with the history, which I always love to start with the history, and just very briefly. I mean, there is this incredible escapade, and you have to call it an escapade, which we start our spying episode with, that Alan Dulles organized back in 1952. I mean, he sent 200 or more Chinese exiles from Hong Kong into northern China with the idea, we've got to do something about Mao Zedong. He's a crazy communist. We've got to unseat him. So he sent in 200 Chinese exiles to cause trouble. And then one of these Chinese exiles said they wanted to get out of China. And so then Alan Dulles sent 2 very young, green CIA agents into northern China in a equivalent of a C-130 and tried to pick up this Chinese agent, and the American plane was shot down. The 2 green CIA agents were captured and sent to jail, many years of solitary confinement for 20 years in China. So that shows the sort of the origins of this fascination in the United States for somehow unseating the communist regime. I don't know what their new espionage ways are, but I think there is a fixation, particularly now, with finding out what they can about China to try and unseat the government. I don't know what's going on, but it's a continuing thread in the relationship between China and the United States. But the United States is in a difficult position, I think, because in 2010, 2012, as you know, 24 assets of the CIA were taken down by the Chinese. There was a leak somewhere, and they found out who the CIA local Chinese assets were, and they were done away with in various means. It's not entirely clear how all of them were killed, but they were killed. And that, I think, sent a shiver down the back of the espionage efforts by the United States to this day.
This is why when you see protests in Hong Kong, I lived in Hong Kong at the time of the 2019 pro-democracy protests, they were obviously organic. They were coming out of universities, but China was able to say, and I believe that the Chinese people believed this, that this was the foreign hand operating in Hong Kong.
Because absolutely. I had a farewell lunch in Beijing. Someone at the foreign ministry who was quite high up. We had been, I wouldn't say friends, but we had, exchanged pleasantries. We'd known each other over a period of time, and this person invited me to lunch, and I thought it would be just a nice 1 hour lunch, a tete-a-tete, and we'd both go on our ways. Well, I turned up, and this person had like 5 aides. I'd turned up just by my little own self. And for 3 hours, I got a lecture about how the Endowment of National Arts or National Humanities, I forget which one, was entirely responsible for the protests in Hong Kong. 3 hours, literally, about how the United States was responsible for what she called the chaos in Hong Kong. And there was nothing I could do.
Explain how that organization is seen as a spy organization in China.
I guess because it's government. Actually, I went back to my office and I looked up what the Endowment of National Humanities had contributed to Hong Kong the previous year, and it was $900,000. Well, I don't think that you stage long-lasting, persevering street protests with $900,000. It's considered to be an underhand organization because it funds programs abroad with American money. And my lunch host actually said Alan Weinstein was responsible for the protests. I said, hey, wait a minute, he's dead. Fortunately, I knew who Alan Weinstein was. He had founded the organization back in the 80s, and he died, I don't know, some years ago.
So lots of conspiracy theories.
Oh, crazy stuff. But what was really interesting was my host had just come from, how some Chinese officials, as they're going up the ladder, they're required to go back to school with the Chinese Communist Party, and they have, 6 weeks of retreats and new lectures and indoctrination on what they need to know. And she had just come from one of those, so I thought, well, this is what they must be teaching these days.
Now, of course, China is definitely spying on the U.S. There's obviously the infiltration of U.S. universities by Chinese Communist Party officials. There's been quite a lot of economic espionage inside tech companies in the U.S. Do you think the U.S. is also guilty, though, of overplaying what's going on?
I do think so, but it's really hard to tell. I'll give you one example where I think the U.S. has overplayed it. Early in the Trump administration, you probably remember this, Washington expelled 60 Chinese journalists. They all worked for Xinhua, People's Daily, other state-run media organizations. And they didn't say it publicly, but they told those of us in the media who were affected that these people were spies, that they were writing reports back to China. Well, I have no doubt that some of them were writing reports back, but I can't imagine that they were of anything of great import. I think some people feel that it's better to have these people in front of you so you can see what they're actually doing rather than expelling them. So they were expelled because they were thought to be spies, which I think was an overstatement. And, the Trump administration did this in the full knowledge that the Chinese government would reciprocate. And so we were all, when I say we, Western journalists were chucked out of China. And this makes for a pretty bad situation where times of tension, it's better to know more about a country than less. And so I think that this fear of spying, which in many cases is well-founded, can also lead to overreach.
Were you yourself thrown out of China? I can't remember.
No.
No. Is that because you're an Australian citizen?
I'm an Australian citizen with a green card. No, I don't think so, because I left it was just luck. I left just before the expulsions.
Okay, so my last question is really about the people of China. You lived there for 7 years and got to see it up close. Do you think everything we've been talking about happens more in the diplomatic and in the C-suites and in think tanks, and that the people of China have a different view of America and vice versa? Or do you think that this hostility is also borne out on the streets?
Well, unfortunately, I'm not there to test this, but I think, there's a massive propaganda machine there, which is to be expected given the type of government. So the United States is not exactly the flavor of the month, and I think that there's a lot of, I don't want to say hostility on the streets, but I understand that it's much more difficult to report on the streets now than it was from 2012 to 2019 when I was there. And it wasn't always easy then, but I think it's very difficult now. I think we can misinterpret how various kinds of people in China look at their government and look at our government. So, for example, I have a Chinese friend. She's in her late 20s. She's a very good journalist. She works for one of the Western outfits. And I often wonder what she thinks of the current Xi Jinping regime, which has put a lot of surveillance on ordinary Chinese people, that it makes it sound as though it's very hard to move, very hard to maneuver, very hard to basically think. You think, my God, 5 cameras on every block, they know exactly where you've been. But I get the sense from my friend and others that, you can adjust to this, that people adjust, that like us, they go hiking, they have meals, they go to Sanlitun, the nice district in Beijing. So people, they don't love it, but they adjust to it. That's something we ought to keep in mind when we try to think about what the temperature's like in China. On the other hand, I know that there's great dissatisfaction in academia, and I had a friend here in New York who is a Chinese academic, and I said, would you go back? And she said, oh my God, I wouldn't even think of going back to Chinese academia. It's so controlled, so patrolled. If I went back, I'd rather go into journalism than into the universities. So that says something. But we don't know enough, and that's why we need reporters, more reporters there.
Well, Jane, congratulations on your new podcast, Face Off, US versus China, which you can listen to on all great podcast platforms. And thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you for producing great podcasts down the line.
That's it for this week. Thanks to Jane for joining us. You can listen to Face Off, the US versus China, wherever you get your podcasts. If you're enjoying whale hunting, make sure to check out our website at whalehunting.projectbrazen.com, where you can also subscribe to our newsletter. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back next week for more. Whale Hunting is a production of Project Brazen. It's hosted by me, Tom Wright, and Bradley Hope. It's produced by Megan Dean and Claire Urban. At Project Brazen, Mariangel Gonzalez is our project manager, Ryan Ho is the creative director, with additional design from Andrea Claridge.